Inside a Toshiba radio cassette player, packed into a brown Samsonite suitcase, sat just under a pound of plastic explosive. It had been loaded onto an aircraft in Frankfurt, transferred at Heathrow, and was now travelling at 31,000 feet above the Scottish border, inside the forward cargo hold of a Boeing 747 named Clipper Maid of the Seas. At 7:03 in the evening on the 21st of December 1988, it detonated. Pan Am Flight 103 broke apart in the night sky above the small Scottish town of Lockerbie. 259 passengers and crew died instantly or in the fall that followed. 11 more residents of Lockerbie died on the ground when sections of the aircraft and a wing full of fuel came down directly onto their homes. 270 people from 21 different countries were killed in less than 3 minutes. It remains to this day the deadliest terrorist attack ever carried out on British soil. My name is the voice behind Creepy Chronicles. This is the Lockerbie bombing. And every fact in this investigation comes from official FBI and Scottish court records, United Nations Observer reports, and decades of confirmed journalism. The flight itself had been scheduled as the middle leg of a longer transatlantic journey, beginning in Frankfurt, West Germany, continuing through a stopover at London Heathrow, and ultimately bound for Detroit, Michigan, with the bulk of its passenger list made up of American servicemen returning home for Christmas, and American university students flying back from a semester studying abroad in Europe. The timing, just days before Christmas, meant the flight was unusually full. What followed the bombing became, for a time, the largest criminal investigation in British history. Led by the smallest police force in the country, the Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary, supported directly by the FBI and Scottish prosecutors. The debris field stretched across 81 miles and covered 845 square miles of southern Scotland. More than 5,000 searchers combed the countryside, eventually recovering 319 tons of wreckage and thousands of individual pieces of physical evidence. Investigators interviewed more than 10,000 people across 16 different countries over the following years. Among that mountain of wreckage, forensic examiners found something extraordinary. A tiny fragment of circuit board, barely the size of a fingernail, embedded in a scrap of charred clothing. That fragment was eventually traced to a specific type of timer manufactured by a Swiss company called Mebo and sold, according to the company's own records, to the Libyan government. Mebo's own founder would later become a controversial figure in the case himself, giving conflicting accounts over the years about exactly which governments and individuals his company had sold its timer devices to, further muddying a piece of evidence the original prosecution had treated as one of its most solid links back to Libya. The clothing fragments themselves were traced to a shop on the island of Malta, a shop owned by a man named Tony Gauci. Gauci told investigators he recalled selling a specific set of clothing items, including a distinctive brand of baby clothes and an umbrella, to a man he could not initially identify with any confidence. Over the course of repeated interviews conducted across more than a year, Gauci's description of the purchaser shifted multiple times, in ways defense lawyers would later argue raised serious doubts about the reliability of the identification. At various points during the investigation, Gauci described a man older, taller, and physically quite different from Megrahi, before ultimately settling on an identification that more closely matched him, a progression that defense teams and independent legal observers alike have pointed to repeatedly in the decades since as a textbook example of how eyewitness memory can be unintentionally shaped by repeated questioning over an extended period of time. In 1991, arrest warrants were issued for 2 Libyan nationals, Abdelbaset al-Megrahi, an officer with Libyan intelligence, and Lamine Khalifa Fima, the station manager for Libyan Arab Airlines in Malta. Both men were accused of placing the bomb-laden suitcase onto a feeder flight in Malta, from where it was alleged to have traveled, unaccompanied, through Frankfurt and onto the doomed transatlantic flight from London. Libya refused to extradite either man for nearly a decade, triggering a lengthy period of United Nations sanctions against the country that severely damaged its economy and international standing. The eventual diplomatic breakthrough came through the unusual involvement of Nelson Mandela, who personally lobbied successive British governments to find a solution that would allow a trial to proceed without Megrahi and Fima being extradited directly into the British legal system. A sticking point Gaddafi's government had refused to move on for years. The compromise, brokered substantially by Scottish law professor Robert Black, was unprecedented. A special Scottish court would be established on neutral territory. At Camp Zeist, a disused American military base in the Netherlands, operating entirely under Scots law, presided over by Scottish judges, but physically located outside the United Kingdom. The trial began in May 2000 and ran for the better part of a year. On the 31st of January 2001, the panel of 3 Scottish judges delivered its verdict. Lamin Khalifa Fima was acquitted entirely. Abdelbaset al-Megrahi was found guilty of 270 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The case against Megrahi rested substantially on 3 pillars. The timer fragment traced to Libya, the clothing traced to Tony Gauchi's shop, and Gauchi's identification of Megrahi as the purchaser. Each pillar, in the years that followed, would come under sustained and serious challenge. Professor Hans Köchler, appointed by the United Nations Secretary-General as an official international observer at the trial, published a formal evaluation in 2001 describing significant concerns with how the case had been prosecuted. He later told the BBC, when the first appeal against Megrahi's conviction was rejected, that the decision represented what he called a spectacular miscarriage of justice. Köchler returned to the subject repeatedly over the following years, issuing further statements in 2003, 2005 and 2007 calling for an independent international inquiry and explicitly accusing Western governments of applying double standards in how they approached criminal justice when it suited their broader geopolitical interests. Robert Black, the very same Scottish law professor who had helped design the unusual Camp Zeist trial structure in the first place, went considerably further. In later years, Black publicly described Megrahi's conviction as the most disgraceful miscarriage of justice in Scotland for 100 years, and said he felt a measure of personal responsibility for having helped persuade Libya to agree to a trial that, in his own later assessment, had gone so badly wrong. He has stated bluntly that every lawyer who reads the judgment in detail tends to reach the same uncomfortable conclusion. In 2003, Megrahi's legal team formally applied to the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission to have the case referred back for a fresh appeal. The commission investigated for 4 years. In June 2007, it announced its decision, referring the case back to the High Court for a second appeal on the basis that it had identified 6 separate grounds on which a miscarriage of justice may have occurred. The Commission's own findings remain, to this day, one of the strongest official acknowledgements that something in the original prosecution may genuinely have gone wrong. In 2008, Megrahi was diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer. In August 2009, the Scottish government released him on compassionate grounds, with doctors estimating he had approximately 3 months left to live. As a condition of accepting compassionate release rather than continuing his appeal, Megrahi was required to formally abandon that ongoing legal challenge, meaning the second appeal, with its 6 identified grounds for a possible miscarriage of justice, was never actually heard to its conclusion in open court. Jim Swire himself, despite everything he had come to believe about Megrahi's likely innocence, publicly argued at the time that keeping a dying man in prison purely to satisfy the legal process would amount to what he called exquisite torture, even as the High Court initially rejected that argument and ruled Megrahi should remain incarcerated while his appeal continued. He survived for nearly 3 more years after his release, living in Libya, continuing to insist publicly that he had played no part in the bombing. Jim Swire, whose 23-year-old daughter Flora died aboard Flight 103, became one of the most prominent and persistent campaigners questioning Megrahi's conviction, an unusual and deeply painful position for a grieving father to occupy, actively arguing that the one man convicted of murdering his child may not have been guilty at all. Swire told reporters plainly that his belief was that the British and American governments had lied about how the bombing was actually carried out. By his late 80s, Swire had spent more than 3 decades of his life pursuing answers, attending court hearings on 3 continents, and outliving the very man he had spent years arguing should never have been convicted in the first place. Swire has also long maintained a competing theory about how the bomb actually entered the aviation system, believing it was loaded directly at London Heathrow, rather than travelling through Malta and Frankfurt as the official prosecution case claimed, a detail that, if accurate, would undermine much of the case built against Megrahi from the very beginning. In 2003, separate from the question of individual guilt, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi agreed to pay more than $2 billion in compensation to the victims' families, a payment made as part of a broader diplomatic effort to have international sanctions against Libya lifted. Gaddafi maintained, even as he authorized that payment, that he had never personally ordered the attack. It was only in 2011, during the civil war that ultimately toppled his government, that Libya's own former justice minister publicly stated that Gaddafi had given the order himself, an allegation that, like so much else in this case, has never been independently and conclusively proven in open court. The story did not end with Megrahi's death. In December 2022, more than 3 decades after the bombing, American authorities took custody of a third Libyan national, Abu Aguila Mohammed Mas'ud, who had been indicted by the United States in 2020 on charges directly connected to the bombing. Prosecutors allege Mas'ud worked for Libyan intelligence from 1973 until 2011, specializing in the construction of explosives, and that he personally built the bomb and helped deliver the suitcase that ultimately reached Megrahi in Malta. He traveled back to Libya, according to the indictment, alongside Megrahi himself on the day of the bombing. Mas'ud pleaded not guilty. As of the most recent confirmed reporting, the case against him continues to move through the American federal court system. The arrival of a second formally charged suspect, more than 3 decades after the original conviction, raises an uncomfortable question this investigation cannot resolve. If Mas'ud's alleged role is accurate, what does that mean for the case originally built almost entirely around Megrahi as the central singular figure behind the attack? Was Megrahi a genuine knowing participant working alongside Mas'ud? Or was he, as Robert Black and Hans Köchler each separately concluded in their own professional assessments, convicted on flawed identification evidence for a crime committed primarily by other people entirely? The case has also continued to generate friction within the community of victims' families itself. A group representing many American relatives publicly criticized the 2025 dramatizations of the bombing, arguing that focusing heavily on Jim Swire's specific doubts about Megrahi's guilt amplified what they considered unsupported theories, while overshadowing the broader, carefully built prosecution case and the years of work by investigators and prosecutors who maintained Megrahi's conviction was sound. That division itself is revealing. More than 3 decades after 270 people died, the families who lost the most are still not united on the most basic question of who, precisely, is responsible. Over the years, theories implicating East German Stasi agents, Palestinian groups linked to a downed Iranian passenger jet earlier in 1988, and various combinations of state and non-state actors have all circulated, none ever displacing the official Libyan account, but none ever fully extinguished by it either. 270 people died in the skies and streets above Lockerbie on a December evening in 1988. Their families have spent more than 3 decades seeking an answer to a single question that should, by now, have a clear and settled response: who killed them and why? Creepy Chronicles investigates the cases where the official verdict and the documented evidence do not fully agree with each other. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, real, documented, told without apology. A shopkeeper's memory, shifting across more than a year of repeated interviews, helped convict the only man the world has ever held responsible for Lockerbie. More than 3 decades later, his country's own senior legal architect still calls that conviction a disgrace. More than 3 decades later, his country's own senior legal architect still calls that conviction a disgrace.